In the last episode of Bible Battles, we examined the slaughter of the kings, when Abraham destroyed the armies from the east and rescued his nephew Lot. In this episode, we are moving forward in history past the Exodus, the conquest of Canaan, and the period of the Judges into the reign of Israel's first king, Saul, to find the rise of a legend, David, who as a boy stepped out to face Goliath, the great Philistine giant. We know the story, but let's dig deeper into its details so we can have a more accurate picture of what happened that day, and be able to better learn the great lessons of this Bible battle teaches us. Open your Bibles to 1 Samuel 17 as we dig deeper into the account of David versus Goliath. Let's dive into the politics of this war. Why were Israel and the Philistines constantly fighting? They had fought each other off and on since the conquest when Israel was unable to take the Philistines' land. They were one of the many antagonists of the period of the Judges, and they continued their fight here in 1 Samuel 17. To find our answer, we open a map and a Bible. The Philistines settled in a neighboring territory to Israel. Like Israel, they had migrated to this area. Genesis 10 records the Table of Nations, where the different peoples of the earth settled after the Tower of Babel. There we find our first reference to the Philistines, in a list of the sons of Mizraim: Casluhim, out of whom came Philistim, and Caphtorim. Later the prophet Amos refers to this origin. Have not I brought up Israel out of the land of Egypt, and the Philistines from Caphtor, and the Syrians from Ker? Caphtor is generally associated with Crete, the island in the northeast corner of the Mediterranean Sea. But it is likely that the Philistines had come from even farther away than that. Within the battle of 1 Samuel 17, we see influence from another area of the world that Israel was unfamiliar with and unprepared for. So both the Israelites and Philistines had conquered land in this relatively small area. But God had promised all of that area to Israel. War between these two nations was inevitable. The Bible description of where this battle occurred is amazingly specific. Coupled with relatively recent archaeological discoveries, we know exactly where this battle happened. Now the Philistines gathered together their armies to battle, and were gathered together at Shochoh, which belongeth to Judah, and pitched between Shochoh and Azekah, and Ephes-dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together, and pitched by the valley of Elah, and set the battle in array against the Philistines. The valley of Elah was a main passageway from the Philistine city of Gath to the Israelite city Hebron. It cuts through a mountainous ridge that separated Israel from Philistia. It would have been of great strategic importance in the ongoing war between these two nations. The Philistine army came as far as Shochoh, but retreated back to Ephes-dammim when Saul and the Israelite army came to the valley of Elah behind him. This picture, taken from Tel Azekah, gives a good perspective of how they would have encamped against each other. The Philistines set up on the ridge on the right, and Israel on the ridge to the left. And of course, David and Goliath meet in the middle. The Israelite army has shown up ready to fight. These were courageous men, willing to risk their lives to protect their homeland from the invading hordes of the Philistines. They had already defeated the Philistines in chapter 14, and were confident they would again. As David approaches the Israelite encampment, the host was going out to the battle line, shouting the war cry, and Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. However, the fight they expect is not the fight they are offered. The giant steps forward with this challenge. Why are you come out to set your battle in array? Am not I a Philistine, and ye servants to Saul? Choose you a man for you, and let him come down to me. If he be able to fight with me and to kill me, then will we be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then shall ye be our servants, and serve us. Goliath repeats this challenge for 40 days, and no one steps forward to accept it. Why was Israel so ill prepared for this battle? This type of battle is called single combat. Instead of armies fighting, a champion from each side would fight one-on-one to decide the battle. This style was great if you had a superior champion, but Israel didn't have a champion at all. This battle style was unheard of in the Middle Eastern countries at this time. Single combat was popular in the Aegean region, the area around the Aegean Sea, including Greece. Around the time of the Exodus, the Greek Mycenaean civilization spreads to Crete, and some migrate and settle on the southeast shore of the Mediterranean Sea, bringing their preferred style of combat with them. Recent excavations of the city of Gath have unearthed a massive city dating back to the time of this battle. This was when the city was at its peak, filled with massive structures built not in the style of Mesopotamia or Egypt, but Aegea. To fight this battle, Israel needed a champion to fight for the nation. And if they were to fight a regular-sized soldier, they probably would have found one. But this champion had to face Goliath. Enter a shepherd boy, who had already slain a few ferocious beasts. The most compelling aspect of this battle is the stark difference between the two men who fought in it. As we examine these two warriors, let's begin with Goliath. Goliath was from Gath, one of the 5 chief cities of Philistia. He truly was a giant at 6 cubits and a span, which is a height of 9 feet 9 inches. It is hard to fathom a man of that size. To put his size into perspective, let's think about a huge human being we all know, NBA legend Shaquille O'Neal. Shaq is 7 feet 1 inch and weighed 325 pounds at the time of this picture. He is a man who towers over nearly everybody in our nation. But Shaq is tiny compared to Goliath. Goliath was 2 feet 8 inches taller than Shaq. To put that into perspective, Shaq is exactly 2 feet 8 inches taller than my 9-year-old son Elijah. Looking at Goliath and Shaq standing next to each other would have been the same as seeing Shaq next to a 9-year-old. Understand, this is not a comparison between Goliath and David, but Goliath and one of the biggest human beings of our time, Shaquille O'Neal. But Goliath wasn't just tall. He was also massive. His coat of mail armor that covered his torso was 5,000 shekels of brass, which translates to around 157 pounds. That's besides the brass helmet and shin guards. For comparison, our Navy SEALs wear body armor that weighs between 35 and 45 pounds. Now, Goliath's size was not his only advantage. He was an experienced warrior. Before allowing David to fight Goliath, Saul tells him, "Thou art not able to go against this Philistine, to fight with him. For thou art but a youth, and he a man of war from his youth." Goliath also had help. When he stepped out onto the battlefield, he did not go alone. A man who carried Goliath's shield went in front of him to battle. At the sight of this mountain of a man, all of the men of Israel were terrified and ran away. Surely there was not a man among the Israelites who could defeat this Philistine champion, right? Let's think about David. David was the youngest son of a shepherd from Bethlehem named Jesse. David only shows up at this battle because his father had sent him to deliver provisions to his 3 oldest brothers who fought in Saul's army. However, David was not just another shepherd boy. In the previous chapter, the prophet Samuel anointed him as the next king of Israel, as the one who is after God's own heart. In the account, David is described as a youth. Was he a child? A teenager? We must remember that in Israel, one was not considered a man until age 30. Given the timeline of events, David would have probably been in his early 20s. Remember, he was old enough to lead the armies of Israel right after the defeat of Goliath. So David was not a little boy or a weakling. He had killed a lion and a bear protecting his father's flock. He was strong enough to cut off Goliath's head. He is also described as ruddy, beautiful, and a mighty valiant man in the previous chapter. Like 20-year-olds today, he was growing into a man's body, still having the face of a boy. From archaeological discoveries in ancient burial grounds, we find the average height of Israelite men was 5 foot 5 inch to 5 foot 9 inch. Given the descriptions of David, I think we can safely put David at the upper end of that average, so let's say 5'10". He was clearly no physical match with Goliath. But While Goliath was physically enormous, David was a spiritual giant. When David comes to the battle, the Israelite army is hunkered down in a trench. And Saul is unsuccessfully trying to bribe anybody to go out and fight the Philistine. When David hears Goliath taunt God's army, he asks the others, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God?" He then convinces Saul to let him fight. The servant slew both the lion and the bear. And this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he hath defied the armies of the living God. David said, moreover, "The Lord that delivered me out of the paw of the lion and out of the paw of the bear, he will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said unto David, "Go, and the Lord be with thee." Like Goliath, when David stepped out onto the battlefield, he wasn't alone. He wrote later, "The Lord is my strength and my shield. My heart trusted in him, and I am helped." Goliath didn't stand a chance. The weapons these two combatants use in this battle are as different as the men are themselves. Warfare throughout time has consisted of three kinds of soldiers: infantry, foot soldiers; cavalry, soldiers who ride something like a horse, chariot; and artillery, those who launch projectiles at the enemy, an archer, sniper. Each of these carry different kinds of weapons. Goliath, a heavy infantry soldier, comes armed to the hilt with three distinct weapons. When David confronts Goliath, he says that Goliath comes with a sword, and with a spear, and with a javelin. First, Goliath had a spear, but no ordinary spear. The staff of this spear was like a weaver's beam. The weaver's beam is the cross-section of a weaver's loom where fabrics are woven together. It has to be strong and sturdy, much bigger than your average spear staff. The spearhead weighed 600 shekels of iron, or around 17 pounds. This spear would have been used mainly for thrusting at the enemy in order to stab him from a distance. Goliath also had a sword. Goliath doesn't use this weapon, but David does. There are a few possibilities for the design of this sword, but probably it was not overly sized up for Goliath. Not only does David use it to behead Goliath, but he also carries it later on while fleeing from Saul. However, when David retrieves the sword from Ahimelech, he says of the sword, "There is none like it." The third weapon that Goliath has was a javelin, but it's never used. David's weaponry was much simpler. He carries with him a staff and a sling. Surely David is outgunned here. Well, maybe not. The sling is an artillery weapon and is one of the most ancient weapons used in warfare. It consisted of a pouch made from either leather or heavily woven fabric, where the slinger would place the projectile, usually stones. Attached to the pouch would be two cords made of woven hair or sinew. Different cultures at different times used different projectiles. Originally, slingers used spherical projectiles, but later found they could be more accurate for further distances with smooth, oval-shaped stones. The more dense the stone, the better. A small but heavy projectile flies farther and truer than a big or light one. David chose 5 smooth stones from the brook bed. That word indicates to try in order to select the best one, the right shape, the perfect size and weight. Now David would have had a few stones in his bag already. He's not going to walk around with an unloaded gun. But those weren't good enough for this occasion. The sling was an incredibly formidable weapon. Not only could stones be slung at incredible speeds, but in the hands of an experienced slinger like David, they were lethally accurate. The Romans employed slings using specially made lead projectiles. It is recorded that a Roman slinger could hit and incapacitate a human target from 130 yards away. In fact, many ancient armies preferred slinging to archery for their artillery. It has been estimated that a trained Roman slinger with their lead projectiles had a similar stopping power to a .44 Magnum pistol. And a sling with a normal stone would have been similar to a .357 or .38. Goliath focused on the staff in David's hand, paying no mind to the sling in David's other hand. David brought a gun to a spear fight, and Goliath never knew what hit him. And he took his staff in his hand, and chose him 5 smooth stones out of the brook, and put them in a shepherd's bag which he had, even in a scrip. And his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. And the Philistine came on and drew near unto David, and the man that bare his shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about, and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, and ruddy, and of a fair countenance. And the Philistine said unto David, Am I a dog that thou comest to me with staves? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, Come to me, and I will give thy flesh unto the fowls of the air, and to the beasts of the field. Then said David to the Philistine, Thou comest to me with a sword, and with a spear, and with a shield. But I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied. This day will the Lord deliver thee into mine hand, and I will smite thee, and take thine head from thee, and I will give the carcasses of the host of the Philistines this day unto the fowls of the air, and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And all this assembly shall know that the Lord saveth not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. And it came to pass, when the Philistine arose, and came and drew nigh to meet David, that David hasted and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag, and took thence a stone, and slang it, and smote the Philistine in his forehead, that the stone sunk into his forehead, and he fell upon his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with the sling and with the stone, and smote the Philistine, and slew him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood upon the Philistine, and took his sword, and drew it out of the sheath thereof, and slew him, and cut off his head therewith. And when the Philistines saw their champion was dead, they fled. And the men of Israel and of Judah arose, and shouted and pursued the Philistines, until thou come to the valley, and to the gates of Ekron. And the wounded of the Philistines fell down by the way to Sha'arim, even unto Gath, and unto Ekron. After the battle, David brings Goliath's head to Jerusalem, dedicates his sword to God, and keeps the armor for himself. Saul promotes David to a captain over his army, and Israel enjoys many more victories under David's leadership. There are so many lessons to learn, I'll try to keep it to just 3. Number 1, learn to choose faith over fear. Why did Israel cower in fear? It was for the same reason they refused to enter the promised land in Numbers 13. They chose fear over faith. All Israel saw was the enormous size of Goliath, and immediately thought, There's no way. But there was no reason to fear. David versus Goliath is not an underdog story. At least not a good one. The underdog lost. The nation didn't know it yet, but David was one of the greatest warriors in the history of Israel. He had a superior weapon, and of course, he had a superior God. I am convinced there were any number of Israelite soldiers who could have defeated Goliath, had they only had more faith to look past the size of Goliath and exploit his weaknesses and trust that God would protect them. Understand that Goliath's defeat was not miraculous intervention from God. He gave David the victory the same way he provides us with victory, through his providence. In life, you're going to face many Goliaths, big, scary-looking problems that will come crashing down if you will rise up to fight them. Select your stones carefully, step up, and know that God fights with you and for you. Number 2, learn to fight when no one will fight beside you. There should have been a line of people willing to step up and fight Goliath, but no one but David would. There will be times in life when no one is stepping up to do what is right, but you have to. There will be times when you are confronted with battles of your own, and others should come to help you, but won't. You must summon the courage of David to step forward to fight anyway. Inspired by your courage, others will find the will to fight with you. Number 3, learn the difference between confidence and arrogance. David was confident. Goliath was arrogant. Each one thought victory was certain. What's the difference? It lies in the reason they thought victory was assured. Goliath thought victory was his because he was big, and David was small. He was insulted that a young person like David would even step out onto the battlefield, especially without a spear, shield, or armor. He was so certain he would win that he didn't even pay attention to the weapon David had, but just charged right into battle. The basis for David's confidence was twofold. One, he knew that God would give him the victory, 2, he had won previous battles against formidable opponents like Goliath, a lion and a bear. In life, you must be confident. It is a key to success in pretty much anything you try to do. But be confident for the right reasons. God is for you. And if God is for you, who can be against you? Since this is a study for fathers and their sons, let's learn a specific lesson that will help us. Before David defeated Goliath, he had killed a lion and a bear. Those victories gave him the confidence to fight the giant. Now consider that as a father, you are your son's bear. When you play games with your son, you can never let him win. At cards, or horse, or checkers. He needs to defeat a lion, not a kitten. That way he can have David's confidence when the Goliaths of life appear. Now pick your favorite sport or game and go demolish your son at it. It's for his own good.